All right, well, thanks everyone for joining. Anyone that doesn't know me, my name is Matt McMahon, and this talk is going to be Bring Out Your Data, Digital Grave Robbing in the 21st Century. All right, we'll jump right into it. I can get my screen to work. Oh, and a pre-warning on this talk. I've only done this talk once before, tried to do this talk, and I was scheduled to do it at Layer 8Con, and being a talk about death, it was fitting right before I did it, a dark cloud came over my house, lightning struck, and I lost power. So let's hope power stays on. So disclaimer, I am not by any means an expert on the topic of death fraud. I'm just, as someone else said, a curious beginner. Opinions are my own, not my employer's. Fraud is illegal, don't do it. And all sources that I cite, all statistics, etc., are cited at the bottom of the page with a link if you'd like to review them. So we'll start with, when we talk about grave robbing, we'll go kind of all the way back to actual grave robbing before we get to digital grave robbing. Kind of start with historical grave robbing, going all the way back to ancient Egypt. Most of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings have been pillaged. They were pillaged anywhere from the 16th to 11th century BCE. This also happens in Central America and Mayan and Aztec sites, unfortunately, and everything from early Romans to the Civil War, etc. This practice happens pretty widely across different locations and cultures, unfortunately, and it tends to happen anywhere where there's wealthy graves or graves that might have things that individuals were buried with things that are materially valuable, living next to a community or fairly close to a community that is economically a little bit disadvantaged, so kind of a transfer of wealth. This practice, actually, interestingly enough, does still exist today in Europe. I found that there is some cases where they've used metal detectors, usually organized crime affiliations, to find or dig up individuals looking for jewelry, gold teeth, things like that. So it seems like a just historical anomaly, but interestingly enough, it is actually still happening. Grave robbing for medical research. This was kind of interesting. In the 1800s, Baltimore was kind of the medical school capital of the world. There was half a dozen medical institutes, and if you were going to school, you can see kind of on the railroad here, the railroad map of the United States, or northeastern United States, all of the railroads kind of terminated in Baltimore at the time. So if you were a medical student, you were going back to school to learn medicine. It was a kind of a BYOC, or bring your own corpse type of affair. So these doctors would have to, or doctors in training would have to find places to be able to acquire corpses or study material to be able to do their learning. So kind of an interesting historical fact, but unfortunately, most of these graves predominantly were African-American graves buried in what's called a potter's grave. So typically a shallow grave that's easy to find and dig up. And if you're looking for more interesting information on this, there was a good book called The Diary of a Resurrectionist that showed this practice happening and detailed it pretty well happening in England. OSINT, or open source intelligence, comes to grave robbing. So kind of fast forward in the timeline to about the 1900s. In this case, criminals would search out tombstones of recently deceased children, or actually not recently deceased, but children that had the same birthday, or roughly the same birthday, at least a year as they were, as that individual that was trying to create a false identity. And they would use that to then basically create a false identity with this child that had passed. This eventually got a little bit problematic with the IRS and Social Security Administration now being aware of an individual's death. Initially, way back when, this took quite a while for individual's death to be recorded in all of the government systems. So you had a couple-month window to be able to actually do this, or criminals had a couple months window to be able to do this. And one of the largest organizations that was doing this was actually the Weather Underground. There was some pretty interesting books on this, but again, using information of recently deceased individuals of a similar age. So they would actually walk through cemeteries as they kind of traveled across the country and plotted their different things that they were doing. and looked for individuals that died. It was generally about a 3-month window they had to be able to steal an identity after the individual died before it was reported to the government, and you know, the government was able to check off if the person died, so that identity would essentially be useless. So, but this is essentially what they did. They just walked through cemeteries looking for individuals roughly of the same age. Yeah, or newspapers as well. That was another, and we'll get into newspapers and obituaries a little bit later, how that's still kind of used in the digital age. So in the digital age, what's interesting is, you know, after you die, you know, hopefully you go somewhere, I don't know, but digitally you actually remain here with us for some time, and criminals search freely available online records of information of recently deceased individuals to be able to try to steal their identity. So they're generally not walking through cemeteries anymore, but there is a number of online repositories that they can look at, which we're going to cover here. Identity theft and the recently deceased. So this is huge. So we talk a lot about, you know, this is the biohacking village. So we talk a lot about PHI, protected health information, PII, personally identifiable information. And we typically think of, you know, the importance of protecting it once you're alive. But once an individual passes, it's actually still really important to protect that. And to show that I mean, this really surprised me, the vast scope of identity theft of the recently deceased in the US. So there's 2 stats I found. One put out by the AARP said that between, and this is a big gap, but between 800,000 and 2.5 million recently deceased. So I think AARP had the 800,000 and the IRS had the 2.5 million. So that's why there's 2 different stats. Of recently deceased people each year have their identity stolen. Now keep in mind that 2.6 million people die every year. So if 2.5 million people have their identity stolen and 2.6 million people die every year, that's a pretty large, significant number of recently deceased people. So this is a kind of a huge problem. A recent audit of the Social Security Administration found that 6.5 million people are aged 112 or older. Obviously, there's not a whole lot of people out there that are aged 112 or older, so that clearly shows that at least, you know, in one government system, the Social Security Administration system, you know, we're not really closing the gap with when an individual dies. You know, we're effectively recording that so that potential victim of identity theft is no longer at risk of that. Interestingly enough, on the converse of that, in 2011, the Social Security Administration mistakenly declared 14,000 people dead that were still very much alive. So it kind of goes both ways. And my understanding is that if you get declared dead and you're not actually dead, it's quite difficult to be declared undead. So don't get declared dead. What's particularly frustrating about this, so, you know, we're at a cybersecurity conference. We all do all the right things that we're supposed to do to protect ourselves. Unfortunately, when you pass, there's a bunch of people that probably know nothing about cybersecurity, despite you telling them about it for most of your life, that are going to be managing all of your data and information. So that can be annoying. Some interesting case studies. So these were just kind of some interesting case studies that I found. In 2019, the Social Security Administration paid out more than 40 million in benefits to 500 dead people in just 3 states. And then over the last 5 years, the U.S. So that was 500 dead people in just 3 states that were not actually dead. I should qualify that. So essentially fraudulent death payments, or fraudulent Social Security payments for people that were deceased, but were still another individual is still receiving benefits. Sorry for that tongue twister. Another stat: over the last 5 years, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Detroit has prosecuted more deceased payee frauds than almost any other region in the country. Again, this kind of goes back to what we're talking about with ancient Egypt. Obviously, you know, economically depressed areas of the country, things like this are going to be more prevalent just because there's more people in bad economic situations, and they you know, they're looking for resources. Defendants, or the defendants. So these were 4 really interesting cases. that I found, and it kind of has a dollar value that's associated with them. So $97,000. In this case, a Redford man was who allegedly paid a homeless woman to pose as his dead mother when investigators came to his house to verify that his mother was still alive but bedridden. So, this person's poor mother had passed. This man was pretending that his mother was still alive to be able to get benefits, Social Security Administration benefits, and others. In this case, collected almost $100,000. The next one, $174,000. A St. Clair man who pretended to be his dead mother in phone conversations with investigators actually was good enough to raise the pitch of his own voice to sound more convincing, so that he can continue to collect Social Security checks. So it tends to be Social Security, but it kind of is other benefits as well. Moving forward, $292,000. Ferndale mother allegedly hid her son's death from the government for a whopping 24 years, pretending at one point that her child was in Ecuador having surgery and claiming that he had died there later. Received $250,000, or actually over $250,000. And then again, $250,000. Detroit man who took on his dead mother's identity for 25 years. His name was Otis. Hers was Iotis or Lotus, I think it is. The name similarities allowed him to sign her name on debit card slips, collect her benefits, etc. So, when I kind of read all these stories and a number of other ones, this is just a small sampling. And these weren't necessarily just the outliers; they were all kind of this bad. But the kind of the one thing I think is like, where are the bodies? If grandma or mom passed, is she behind the couch? Is she buried out in the field? Kind of scary. So identifying fraud. So this, it may seem like, some of you out there may be thinking, wow, this is a great idea. The Social Security Administration actually has a really good way of catching up with these individuals. They specifically search for individuals over 90 years old. If you're over 90 years old, you're probably not in that great physical health. Certainly, there's probably some 90-year-olds out there still running 5Ks, but not a whole lot. You probably have a couple medical conditions that you're currently managing. So in this case, the Social Security Administration, specifically in Detroit, did an audit or looked for individuals over 90 years old that had not filed a medical claim in 10 years. So you're 90 or over 90, you haven't gone to the doctors since you were 80. Pretty unlikely. So pretty easy way to kind of close the loop on that. Voter fraud. So this is kind of a survey talk where we're going to talk about a lot of different types of death fraud, and this is one that kind of came up. So I thought I'd kind of cover it quickly. It's initially when I wrote this talk, it was in an election year, so it was a little bit more prevalent, or not prevalent, but a little bit more pertinent. But it is important to note that voter fraud, despite the claims of politicians that millions of dead people, or dead Americans, I should say, do vote every year, it's actually fairly uncommon. And to not perpetuate any political narrative, I didn't really want to pull stats from one side of the political spectrum or the other, which were both fairly biased. But it will revisit Detroit. In a 2019 study, Detroit had 2,508 dead individuals as registered voters. But this isn't really malicious. It's just, again, a government record system. People die. If your loved one dies, the first thing you're probably not going to do is run down to the voter registration booth and inform them that they passed. So while this is a potential risk, again, this is 2,508 voters in all of Detroit. And these people live where they live. They don't live in key demographic areas. They just live where they happen to live when they pass. So, if you look at kind of having worked in some political campaigns myself, I can say that, whether it's the newer unfortunate and malicious Cambridge Analytica ways that individuals are using social media to try to persuade key demographics, or just the old school, kind of like we did, of going to you can go to an elderly high rise in a key demographic swing district and essentially throw a pizza party and a handshake party with your candidate. that tends to be a lot more effective than trying to line up, okay, one individual, or I have to imagine this as I've never done this, but trying to find, okay, there's one individual that died in this district, let's get someone to pretend that they're that individual, then vote. Again, just using standard political things that people have done in the past, trying to get people to vote, probably a lot easier than actually convincing dead people to vote. So just food for thought. Faking your own death. So that could be a whole other talk. I kind of dove into that a little bit. And this is interesting. This is faking your own death or someone else's death. A lot of times this is an individual that's in a very bad abusive relationship where they're trying to fake their own death to get away from this individual. Might be a get away from an individual in a position of power or authority. But they may be doing it to obtain life insurance or escape as I said, a life-threatening situation. Again, whole different presentation. But if you want to kind of learn more about that, these two books are great. How to Disappear and Playing Dead especially was really, really good. So check those out if anyone's interested in despair. Death fraud. So typically, big picture, why do individuals engage in death fraud? And again, I am not an expert. This is just this is me kind of Googling and using a little bit of OSINT and finding out a lot of this. This actually whole talk came about kind of in an interesting way. I worked for an electronic medical record system for a while, and now I'm in cybersecurity. So I'm constantly thinking about, okay, how's something vulnerable? How might you pen test that? I was at Thanksgiving and a family member brought up that they were now a salesperson at a software company that sold cemetery management software. So the gears kind of started going in my head of, okay, how is that vulnerable? Is there PHI? Is there PII? Is there financial information? So that's kind of how this all came about. So kind of running down that rabbit hole, that's where I came to, the ends of why someone would actually perpetuate death fraud. So, the biggest one, which we talked a little bit about before, receiving the dead's income while pretending that they're still alive. A lot of times this is, family members or caregivers. Filing fraudulent tax returns. This is one of the top FBI's dirty dozen. So one of the things that they investigate often. Identity theft, acquiring credit cards, opening lines of credit to establish even just cell phone service, or a more longer term strategy of opening bank accounts to establish a long-term credit. So where do you get the information that you need to do this? And I have tried to eliminate, a couple steps from what I've found so that this isn't just a, how to do it identity theft talk. You have to do a little bit more research, try to protect the public a little bit, even though, again, what was it, 2.5 million out of the 2.6 million people that die every year, unfortunately have this happen. So just trying to kind of protect the general populace. And if, you have parents, loved ones, grandparents that are getting a little bit older, kind of give some ideas of how you can protect these individuals. So when someone passes, what's the first thing that we generally do? We write this very long soliloquy about them, usually in the form of a obituary. If you look at this obituary, so this is an actual obituary that I did tailor a little bit. I added a few things in it, but I would say about half to 2/3 of the items in here were actually in the obituary that was in the paper that I found online. So you can see just a whole mother load of PHI, name, current town, where they lived before, so maybe password reset questions, the day that they died, when their funeral services are going to be, so when they're going to be essentially out of the house, if someone wanted to physically try to break into a house and steal some of their things. You can kind of get a sense of their financial situation based on, in this case, fraternal organizations, charitable contributions, what they did for business. In this case, they were the sole owner of a business. Religious affiliations, you can kind of figure out what they died of. And in this case, they're doing donations to the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, most likely died of cancer, I have to assume. And again, possible password reset questions. They even have the name of their cat here, Mittens, name of family members, surviving spouse, children, parents, all that. So, again, we think of this stuff as being really bad if it gets out when the individual's alive in the case of a patient, but think about it as being of what we just talked about, just as bad in this case, in the case of recently deceased. Oh, and these are, not just in the papers anymore, but these tend to be publicly shared on Facebook. And then also not just the obituary, but the comments in the obituary. If you go to an online obituary and then see the comments, there's a whole treasure trove of other information in the comments. Also, often, again, online obituaries have a tribute video, so you can see this play tribute movie, which often will show, a loved one, a spouse, walking through a house with a video camera, usually a phone or something, and showing this is where they worked, this is where they did this is the cat mittens that they love. And if this is an individual trying to case a house, they don't even need to case the house. The spouse just did that, kind of walking around showing everything valuable in the house. So kind of consider that when you're writing a obituary for your loved one. So compare all of that information we just got from the obituary with what you need to open a line of credit. So again, first name, last name, all of the things that there's pretty much everything on this list for the most part was either in the obituary, or you can easily find it, besides social security number. So basically the only thing that you're lacking now to open a line of credit is a social security number. So what do you do to avoid putting all this information out there? There are other options. So you can do an alternative is a restricted online memorial. So essentially it's obituary, you create a there's a number of software companies that do this. You essentially create a website for this individual and then invite people to it. Obviously you're grieving, you want to let as many people know as possible so they, can be made knowledgeable about it, but then come to the wake or funeral service, whatever it is. Makes you feel better, makes you feel like your family member was loved. But again, if you are kind of, especially if that individual is fairly wealthy and you're worried about their assets being, stolen from someone, you could do this private online memorial. Social security numbers. So, there is a number of ways to gather a social security number. Again, I'm trying to not give you all of the information. So that's kind of not creating a step-by-step guide on how to do this, but again, just kind of raising awareness. So the Social Security Administration does publish what's called the Death Master File of individuals that have been deceased. It is restricted, so generally usual individuals can't access this, but it is accessible by financial firms, credit firms, government agencies, etc., to match up your records to say, okay, this individual did recently die. This is good because then they can close out your lines of credit to make sure no one abuses it. Yeah, so this site does restrict access, so that's good. And one thing that I thought was interesting that I didn't actually know until researching this may be common knowledge, but the first 3 letters of your social security number actually denote your place of birth. So you can see on the right, there's that's where that comes from. So I don't know, I'm probably oblivious and everyone else knew that, but I didn't. Let's see. So the Social Security Death Index. So another place that in the past, these attackers used to go to try to get this information was genealogy websites. So this was, let's see, genealogy websites pull social security numbers again from that Social Security Death Index. So this was used at sites like, what is this? Yeah, so Legacy Tree, any place where you kind of track, track your deceased relatives, kind of going all the way back to the old country, wherever they came from. So this database basically populates if you're deceased after 1936, and it documents about 93 to 97% of people that have been deceased, and you can actually see what's kind of included on the record on the right hand side. Again, restricted information, but this is how financial organizations and things like that get this information. how attackers used to get this was genealogy sites. And up until fairly recently, genealogy sites for everyone in their database listed a social security number. So again, you're an attacker, you went to the the listing of the individual's passing, or maybe you actually in person visited their wake to do some actual in-person intelligence gathering. Now they're going to the genealogy site to gather, a little bit later, to gather the rest of the information potentially. Again, I've never done this. I'm just kind of guessing how people would do it. So this is meant to be open for hopefully further research of how we can kind of lock this down and not have 2.5 million people's recently deceased people's identities getting stolen each year, according to the IRS. So, definitely open to more research. So the good thing is, back in 2011, Ancestry.com and a lot of the other genealogy.com websites were pressured to start stripping that information. So, again, the government catches up with this fairly quickly, like 3 months after your passing in most cases. So in this case, it was since 2011, they've stopped adding social security numbers in their records for anyone that passed within the last 10 years. So the hope is, if you passed 10 years ago, all your records are closed out. Your account can't be used for fraud anymore. So that's great. What's really interesting, and this was fascinating, this was actually on genealogy.com's website. It actually told you how to find a social security number. This was literally a screenshot from their website. So, if you're looking for your dead relative, or, hopefully not in this case, an attacker is looking for someone's social security number, it literally tells them how to try to find other places where you can go to try to find it, which is mind-boggling. You can look carefully at the death certificate, obviously, for your family member and you have it. In this case, it says, check with funeral home that handles arrangements. They may have a record of this deceased social security number. So they're basically telling you to social engineer the mortician, which is wild. So again, Googling grandma, there are a number of genealogy sites claiming to offer this social security information. And at the time that I initially created this, I put this in for someone that I knew wasn't very close to me, but that recently passed. And I didn't go out and get pay to have membership, or pay to have accounts for all of these different genealogy sites. But what was advertised to me was a listing of people that it could potentially be. And then down on the bottom, it told me that there's more to see. So I don't know if this is, they're being truthful or not, but they're saying for this, in this individual case, they had the social security number, issue year, birth date, and death date. So if I did sign up for an account, I could potentially find that information. Again, I'm not an attacker, so I did not, but I was curious what was out there. Yeah, so again, Ancestry.com and a lot of the mainstream genealogy sites are committed to restricting access to social security numbers. I don't know if all of them are. There's a lot of them out there. Obviously, where else can you get social security numbers? There's a number of breaches out there. Hopefully, that's not a place where we're still able to get those, but obviously, potential source that we want to be aware of. And what about social engineering? Again, your loved one recently passed. You're in a state of shock. You're getting a number of calls from different organizations trying to close out their accounts. Unfortunately, attackers, it's pretty easy for them to call up the spouse if they have the number, which maybe the number was actually in the obituary, and say, hey, I'm so-and-so from whatever bank that the individual, maybe Bank of, just say Bank of America, or some large bank that you're hoping that you get a hit and they actually have, trying to close out their account. I just need this information, which is the information that they need to then kind of open a line of credit. So, again, just kind of things to think about as our loved ones pass and kind of want to be protective of. Or again, as I said earlier, in many cases, they find that these scammers may actually attend your funeral to gather more intelligence value. So, this is a very technical community that I'm presenting to. What amazing radical OSINT tools did I use? Shodan, Harvester, none of them. I mean, everything that I covered was looking at obituaries, Googling, social engineering. It's just, it's too simple. That's why it's so prevalent. You don't need technical skills to do this. It's pretty bad. If I were an attacker, what might I do? Which again, areas you might want to protect. Oversharing on Facebook. We do it when we're alive. We certainly do it when we're dead. Online obituaries, oversharing there. That open, unrestricted memorial website that a lot of people create. Looking at those past breaches and trying to line up that data, social engineering the widow, kind of all things that I've talked about. So who would do this? This is horrible. Who would actually, go to a funeral and pretend to be someone's, loved one? Strangers, honestly, more often than not, typically locate a victim via online obituary, and they tend to be in the area, geographic area. Certainly, they might be from another country too, but it's easy geographically to just kind of look at the local paper and see who recently passed, and then you actually have physical access. You can go and visit the actual funeral or wake as well. Unfortunately, family members do this as well. Again, especially in situations where there's economic hard times, and then often too, professional caregivers. They often have access to the residents. So this might be an elderly individual who, this person is the person that's attacking them, is either living with them or staying in their house a significant amount of time, has access to file cabinets, financial information, medical information, things like that. Pair that with a lot of these, if it's a CNA, something like that, these individuals aren't making a lot of money. And pair that with the fact that the healthcare sector in the US is the third sector in the US for fraud, behind, I think it's, was it finance and then government. So what do you do? How do you protect your family? Apologies for the small text, but there's a lot of things. So immediately deactivate the accounts of your recently deceased individual. If you're worried about this happening to you, put in your estate planning, list out all of your accounts and say that you want them to be immediately deactivated. So credit cards, things like that. Make 12 copies of the death certificate. Anyone that's had to do this recently, that you actually have to pay for each copy. So it is a little bit expensive, but I think it was the IRS recommends that you get 12 copies. Send the IRS one copy of the death certificate. Send copies of the death certificate to all 3 credit reporting agencies so they know not to allow a new line of credit to be opened, and ask them to put a deceased alert on the person's credit report. Review the deceased credit report for any questionable recent new activity. Limit putting personally identifiable information, again, online or in the obituary on Facebook. Notify the Social Security Administration about the death. So just to give you a sense of scope, in 2014 alone, thieves stole $55 million worth of Social Security benefits from deceased individuals. So again, it's a big problem. Notify all financial institutions, so banks, mortgage companies, things like that. And that's why you have those 12 copies of the death certificate, because you're probably going to need those. Notify the Department of Motor Vehicles, so their license, things like that. Remove that deceased individual from any joint accounts, and then use caution again when posting on social media. We know this, but. So that's most of my presentation. My ask, if you've been kind of following this, you're probably aware that this likely happens more so to older individuals that are not very tech savvy. So, if you have the ability and some time to be able to help, volunteer your time with older individuals that aren't quite as tech savvy and have some serious concerns about cybersecurity, potentially look maybe at a senior center to do a quick presentation on, either this topic or presenting data. Sure, feel free to steal this talk and give it anywhere else. Older individuals are tend to be less familiar with technology. And according to a study in 2017, senior citizens are twice as likely as younger adults to be duped by phishing. So definitely, consider that and consider volunteering. Further readings, just some interesting books that I kind of stumbled upon along the way that you might find interesting. Again, that Playing Dead, Stiff, so what happens to a human cadaver after they die. Butchering Art, and Days of Rage was about the Weather Underground. So just some interesting readings. This is me, and that was my talk. So hope you like it. This is pre-recorded, but I think I'm sticking around to answer some questions. So yeah, reach out if you have any questions, and hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.